What can men do against such reckless hate?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. There are two dimensions to the Southport incident: the incident itself and the response to it. Ironically, the roots of the incident and the response lie in the same psychology.
Are you sure you want to hear this?
Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. If you don't know me, I have written a couple of books on this subject. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. So the roots to the incident itself, why it happened, and the response lies in the same psychology. But what is that psychology and what is really happening here? Well, here's a hint.
Fear is the path to the dark side.
Have you ever heard that before? And by the way, do you believe it? If you've heard it, do you believe it? Now, before I address the question why in more detail, why this is happening, I want to refresh memories regarding the thinking around this case. It's also the psychology around this case. Our thinking shapes our psychology shapes our thinking. Now, according to an article published on the BBC, quote, "The BBC has removed a 2018 Children in Need campaign video from its websites after it emerged it featured the Southport stabbing suspect. Axel Rudakabana, the teenager accused of murdering 3 girls at a dance class on Monday, appeared in the advert aged 11, as first reported by the Daily Mail. It is understood that he was contracted by the BBC for the video through a casting agency. A BBC Children in Need spokesman confirmed the video has now been removed from all of its platforms out of respect to the victims, adding, "Our deepest sympathies go out to everyone impacted by the shocking case," end quote. Now, I've seen a number of platforms and comments accusing the BBC of covering up. In other words, by removing the content, they're covering it up. Well, let's try to think about this sensibly for a second. And I must say, a lot of what I'm about to say, many of you aren't going to like. I'm not saying this to be popular, and I'm not trying to say this to be liked. I'm simply trying to convey the reality of the situation. Take it or leave it, like it or not. Let's say, out of an abundance of transparency, the BBC deliberately left the ad in place. Is that what you would have wanted? What would happen if you did that? Well, you have a murderer starring in a commercial that's now going to be watched a lot more, and perhaps that's going to lead to certain revenues for the wrong reasons, and the poor charity that used the child actor now gets tarnished by association in the process. I can also tell you, having covered these sorts of crimes in the USA, and there have been many, there's often a deliberate effort not only to keep the perpetrator's name and face out of the media, but also not to disclose a manifesto. They often do leave behind a manifesto. And these perpetrators know that the media are going to republish and circulate their manifestos. And so by publishing this sort of content in the past, the media have unwittingly played right into the playbook of the perpetrator who is angling for instant fame, instant visibility. And so should the media be part of that process? I would say no. In 2 minutes, I'm going to share what the psychological roots of the Southport incident are and the response to it. It's quite simple. But before I do, I want to say a few things, again, that many of you don't want to hear. And so if you don't want to hear it, block your ears, start your stopwatches, and then I'll see you guys again in 2 minutes. For the rest of you, I'm going to let you in on a little insight not only what's going on in this perpetrator's heart and mind, but yours as well. Now, in terms of what many of you don't want to hear, I had to deal with this same issue, of spreading notoriety for and on behalf of a killer, and, who was invisible before his acts when I wrote a book profiling these killers. Do you show their faces and, in a sense, give them their dying wish, or don't you? How do you identify them without identifying them? And should you even identify them to begin with? Now, I don't know whether that situation is exactly taking place here, because in this case, the killer has covered his face. So one wonders whether he's thinking about it in an expanded way, the way some of these others have. Now, of course, if you understand the psychology from the perpetrator's twisted perspective, the whole notion of being invisible and social death, all of this makes sense. To me, the notion of him walking into the courtroom and smiling, it kind of makes sense in that respect. On the other hand, if you're ignorant of this, and if you prefer the simplest answer to reality, which is more subtle and nuanced, then it's very tempting to gravitate to exciting and sexy conspiracies of big media and cover-ups and similar nonsense. It's the sort of oversimplified, untrue stuff that you can expect from the peddlers of populist but kindergarten-level analysis. It's really making appeals to the reptilian brain, which isn't the most sophisticated part of a human being. And sadly, some of the biggest platforms out there are doing this. And so now we come down to it. Why do people love being told how terrifying and scary the world is? In this case, why have things been exaggerated in the way that they have been?
What can men do against such reckless hate?
The answer to who Alex Rudakabana really is, how he became who he is, and what's underlying his psychology is dead simple, and it can be defined and summarized in a single word. Are you sure you want to hear this? That word is anxiety.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
That's exactly what's going on here from his perspective. What happens when a human being, any human being, becomes basically locked away from other human beings? Maybe he doesn't feel good enough. Maybe he's told he's not part of the community. Maybe he realizes on some level he isn't good enough, or he isn't part of the community. Whatever the reason is, he's not integrating into the community. Now, whatever the answer is, the reality is that a young person with zero agency feels incredible levels of anxiety. This anxiety is like a living death, and we're told Axel was a shut-in. That's at 17 years old. A shut-in who never seemed to go out, had no friends, and likely had no girlfriend either. Now, you may not care about Rudakabana's lack of social life, but I'm sure he did. You may not care what the reasons were that he felt too afraid to go out, but I'm sure he did. Now let's deal with the response to the stabbings in Southport. Can you guess what the reason is that so many people reacted in exactly the same way, and also why huge amounts of people don't seem to care about facts or reality? Well, it's because large swathes of the community in Britain are afraid, and they've been told to be afraid, and they've been given reasons to be afraid. Are those reasons rational? Sometimes, some are, I think, but some aren't. The bottom line is we now have communities riddled with anxiety too. And after this incident, people feel afraid to go outside. And after this incident, people are afraid for their children. But, and this is the important part, before this incident, the anxiety was there to begin with. Is this anxiety rational? How much of it is rational? Can I be honest, as someone living in South Africa, the concern I see both in the UK and the USA for migrants feels overblown. You might say, no, it's not overblown at all. Let me continue. Besides law, I also studied economics at university, and I graduated with a degree in economics. Let's, for a moment, look at this sensibly through the prism of economics. If people in first world countries fear migrants, what's the main thing people in first world countries fear about migrants? Crime and losing their jobs. That's what you're afraid of, right? The unemployment rate in the UK right now is 4.4%. And the reason people, including myself, have travelled to first world countries, not only the UK but places like South Korea and the USA, well, it was for work. This influx creates more jobs and more demand for housing and more demand for consumables and many other things, which leads to better property markets and bigger banks and stronger currencies. The UK is the 5th strongest currency in the world. Crime in the UK is on the rise in recent years, and it's a legitimate question to ask why this is happening. Now, I know what the default reasoning is for the uptick in crime, but I would say it's overly simplistic and not entirely accurate. One of the possible reasons for this change in crime stats is a significant reduction in government spending on police services, from almost £20 million in 2010 to £16 billion 8 years later. In 2019, there were only 150,000 police officers in the UK. There is also a popular trend now to blame or criticize the police in the UK, and these increasing levels of disrespect discourage people from wanting to become police officers as well. If the USA aren't careful, their steadily decreasing crime levels are going to head back upwards if they don't change their cynical attitudes towards local law enforcement. Now listen, you can be afraid if you want to, but if I can offer a suggestion, travel a little and you'll see how much the UK has actually got going for it. You'll see what these crime levels actually look like when taken in the proper perspective. These are the stats for example, when we compare gun murders in the UK to the USA. Would you prefer to look at knife murder stats? And although the homicide rates in the UK are fairly high for a developed country, they could be a lot worse. The USA also has terrible anxiety about immigration, and yet when I drive around, when I drove through America over a period of months, I struggled to see homeless folks or beggars or crime in America. Despite what people think is declining and has been declining for decades. The unemployment rate right now in the USA is 4.3%. I know immigration is also an issue in America, but doesn't it come down to what is the unemployment rate? In America right now, almost everyone is working. Demand is high, and guess what? America also has one of the world's strongest currencies because it's a country where people want to go to, like the United Kingdom. America has the 10th strongest currency behind the euro, which is in 9th place. I live in a country where white people comprise about 7.7% of the population. That's less than 1 out of every 10 people in South Africa are white. Do you know what? It is possible to live here. It is possible to work here. I think the unemployment rate in South Africa is the highest in the world. It's over 34%. So I think if you're concerned about people who aren't like you, and if you're concerned about high crime levels, spare thought for folks who have far better reason for anxiety than you do. And so here is another fairly old statistic, but it illustrates just how high certain crime rates are in some countries relative to other countries. In the UK, there were 590 homicides recorded in the year ending March 2023, 14% lower than the previous year. In 2023, there were 24,494 murders in South Africa, which is similar to the rate of countries in a war zone.
What can men do against such reckless hate?
Well, how about we answer that question? Don't become hateful yourself. Don't become fearful yourself. Control your anxiety. Educate yourself. Stop consuming mindless social media that tells you what you want to hear and things that stoke your anxiety. The murder rate in South Africa is a rate of 45 per 100,000 people, compared with a rate of 6.3 in the United States and around 1 in most European countries. You can also start listening to qualified, credible people and use your own common sense. But most of all, be aware of your own anxiety. Get proper perspective, get the right context, and find out how reasonable and rational it is in the real world. I mean, there's an aspect to fear that is good, where you respond and adapt in the appropriate way. But unreasonable fear is bad. And I've seen many scoff at my assessment of the Southport incident. But studies show a real relationship between knife crimes, social exclusion, and social media. What is social exclusion? It's people without a sense of belonging. How hard or how easy is it to make someone feel that they belong or feel welcome in a school situation, for example? Which is to say, many of these crimes are preventable if people in the first world simply learn to get along.
Why can't we all just get along?
You might say that's easy for you to say, but actually it is, because I've traveled to your countries and I would say, can't you guys just get along? Because that's what we've had to do in other countries where we've got far more anxiety. And that is the solution, part of it, in these other countries. So maybe at least think about what I've said here, and also think about what Yoda said and whether you still believe it or not.
Fear is the path to the dark side.
Is it? Well, it certainly is something that some people, cynical people, evil people can take advantage of. So make sure you've got a handle on your own fear and not somebody else.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Food for thought.
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.